The year was 842, and the morning mist clung to the Scottish coastline like a burial shroud. Beneath that grey veil, something extraordinary was about to unfold. A sight so shocking that it would echo through Viking halls for generations to come. The greatest sea raiders in history, men who had terrorized every shore from Ireland to Constantinople, were turning their longships around. Not because of storms or failed navigation, but because of fear. Raw, primal terror of an enemy they had never encountered before. This wasn't supposed to happen. These were the same warriors who had sacked Paris, who had made kings tremble and monks pray for deliverance. Yet here they were, rowing backward into the open sea, their knuckles white against the oar handles. What could possibly make the sons of Odin retreat without even drawing their swords? The answer lies buried in the misty Highlands of Scotland, written in blood across forgotten battlefields and whispered in the darkest corners of Norse mythology. Today, we're going to uncover the truth about the only people who made the Vikings genuinely afraid. Not through superior numbers or better weapons, but through something far more terrifying, something that challenged everything the Norse believed about warfare, honor, and victory itself. But before we reveal this legendary enemy, we need to understand just how unprecedented this fear truly was. The Vikings had conquered everywhere they set foot. They had turned the sight of their dragon-proud ships into a symbol of inevitable doom. From the monasteries of England to the rivers of Russia, their reputation was built on one simple truth. They came. They conquered. They left nothing but ashes and empty halls behind them. So when we tell you that there was one people who not only resisted them, but actually made them flee in terror, you'll understand why this story has remained hidden for over 1,000 years. The implications were too dangerous, too damaging to the carefully constructed legend of Viking invincibility. But the evidence is there, carved in stone, buried in graves, and preserved in the most unlikely of places. The morning that changed everything began like any other Viking raid. 36 longships had crossed the North Sea, their crews hungry for plunder and glory. These weren't desperate outcasts or untested warriors. These were seasoned raiders, men who had seen the walls of Constantinople and lived to tell the tale. Their leader was Magnus Bloodaxe, a chieftain whose very name had become synonymous with unstoppable violence. They had studied their target for months. Intelligence gathered from captured traders painted a picture of a wealthy settlements nestled in the Scottish Highlands, protected by nothing more than wooden palisades and local militias. The perfect target for a swift, brutal raid. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. As their ships approached the shoreline, something felt different. The usual signs of panic were absent. No smoke from hastily extinguished cooking fires. No sounds of people fleeing inland. No abandoned fishing boats pulled hastily onto the beach. Instead, there was an eerie silence that made even the most battle-hardened warriors grip their weapons tighter. The first sign that this raid would be unlike any other came when they spotted the watchtowers. Not the crude wooden structures they expected, but sophisticated stone fortifications positioned at impossible angles on the cliff tops. Whoever had built these understood defensive architecture better than most Roman engineers. These weren't the work of primitive tribesmen. These were the creations of military minds that had been perfecting the art of war for centuries, but it was what they saw next that should have made them turn around immediately. As the morning mist began to lift, the hillsides revealed themselves to be alive with movement. Not the chaotic flight of terrified civilians, but the disciplined positioning of warriors who had been waiting for them. Warriors whose bodies were covered in intricate blue patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the uncertain light. The Picts had been watching them since their ships first appeared on the horizon. Magnus Bloodaxe had faced painted warriors before. Celtic tribes often adorned themselves with simple designs for battle. But this was something entirely different. The blue patterns covering these defenders weren't random daubs of color. They were complex, interwoven designs that seemed to tell stories, mark territories, and convey meanings that the Norse couldn't comprehend. More unsettling still, the paint seemed to make the warriors blend seamlessly with the landscape itself. One moment you could see a figure clearly silhouetted against the sky. The next, he had vanished so completely that you questioned whether he had ever been there at all. This wasn't natural. This was something that challenged the very foundations of how warfare was supposed to work. The Vikings prided themselves on their ability to inspire terror through shock and overwhelming force. They would beach their ships, form their shield wall, and advance with such ferocity that most enemies would break and run before the first blow was struck. It was a formula that had never failed them. Until now, instead of fleeing, the painted warriors seemed to multiply. What had appeared to be a manageable number of defenders suddenly became dozens, then hundreds, emerging from concealment with the fluid grace of wolves. They didn't form traditional battle lines or challenge the raiders to honorable combat. Instead, they simply watched and waited. That waiting was perhaps the most unnerving thing of all. Vikings were accustomed to enemies who either fled in terror or charged forward in desperate courage. These defenders did neither. They stood with the patience of mountains, their blue-marked faces expressionless, their weapons held with casual confidence. It was as if they knew something the raiders didn't. Magnus Bloodaxe made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Despite every instinct screaming at him to retreat, despite the obvious signs that this was unlike any raid they had ever attempted, he ordered his men to advance. Pride, reputation, and the expectations of his crew demanded nothing less than total victory. The landing itself proceeded without opposition. The painted warriors allowed the Vikings to drag their ships onto the beach, form their battle formations, and begin their march inland. This apparent passivity gave the raiders false confidence. Perhaps these strange defenders were all show and no substance. Perhaps the elaborate fortifications and mysterious paint were nothing more than desperate attempts to appear more formidable than they actually were. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The first attack came not as a frontal assault, but as something far more insidious. As the Viking formation moved through what appeared to be an abandoned village, the very ground seemed to turn against them. Concealed pits opened beneath their feet, sending fully armored warriors tumbling into carefully prepared spikes. False paths led to dead ends where crossbow bolts whistled from invisible positions. Buildings that appeared empty erupted with defenders who struck once and vanished before retaliation was possible. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the tactical sophistication of these attacks. It was their surgical precision. The painted warriors weren't trying to destroy the entire Viking force. They were targeting specific individuals with an accuracy that suggested intimate knowledge of Norse battle formations and command structures. Leaders were isolated and eliminated, while their subordinates watched helplessly. Communication between different parts of the raiding force was systematically severed. Within hours, Magnus Bloodaxe realized he wasn't fighting an army. He was fighting a landscape that had learned to kill. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These were men who had faced Saxon shield walls and survived Irish ambushes. They had fought in storms that would have terrified lesser warriors and emerged victorious from battles that should have been impossible to win. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The painted warriors fought with a cold, methodical efficiency that was the antithesis of everything the Vikings understood about combat. There was no berserker fury, no glorious charges, no individual displays of heroism. Instead, there was a relentless, patient dismantling of their formation that felt more like being consumed by some vast, intelligent predator than engaging in honest warfare. As night fell on that first day, the surviving Vikings found themselves trapped in an alien landscape where every shadow might conceal an enemy, and every sound might herald their doom. The painted warriors had not sought to annihilate them quickly. Instead, they had chosen something far more cruel. They were being hunted. The hunting began at midnight. Magnus Bloodaxe had positioned sentries in a defensive circle around their makeshift camp, but the painted warriors seemed to move through their lines like ghosts passing through walls. Men who had stood watch for decades, whose survival depended on their ability to detect the slightest disturbance, reported seeing nothing. Yet when dawn broke, 3 more Vikings were gone. Not killed in their sleep, not dragged away screaming, simply gone. As if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The remaining weapons and equipment were left untouched. Personal belongings remained exactly where they had been placed. Even valuable silver arm rings lay undisturbed beside empty bedrolls. This wasn't about plunder or conquest. This was about sending a message that penetrated deeper than any blade could reach. The message was simple and terrifying. We can take anyone we choose, whenever we choose, and there is nothing you can do to stop us. By the 3rd day, the psychological warfare had achieved what no frontal assault could have accomplished. These battle-hardened raiders, men who had laughed at death and carved their names into history with blood and iron, were jumping at shadows. Every rustling branch might conceal a painted face. Every bird call might be a signal between invisible enemies. The very air seemed thick with menace and malevolent intelligence, but it was the discovery that broke their spirit entirely. While searching for fresh water, a scouting party stumbled upon something that would haunt their nightmares for years to come. Hidden in a grove of ancient oaks, they found a collection of carved standing stones. These weren't crude monuments or simple grave markers. They were masterworks of artistic and engineering skill that spoke of a civilization far older and more sophisticated than anything the Vikings had encountered. Each stone bore intricate spirals and symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. More disturbing still, some of the carvings appeared to depict Viking ships and warriors with an accuracy that should have been impossible. How could these people have known exactly what their enemies would look like? How could they have predicted the specific designs of longships that had been built hundreds of miles away? The implications were staggering. Either these painted warriors possessed some form of supernatural foresight, or they had been preparing for this specific conflict for generations. Both possibilities were equally terrifying to men whose worldview was built on the belief that they were the ultimate predators. Among the standing stones, the scouts found something even more unsettling. Carefully arranged in precise patterns were the weapons and armor of Vikings. Not ancient artifacts or ceremonial displays, but recent acquisitions. Swords still stained with salt from sea voyages. Mail shirts that bore the distinctive craftsmanship of Norse smiths. Shields painted with clan symbols that the current raiders recognized from previous expeditions. These weren't trophies taken from the current raid. These were remnants of previous Viking forces that had ventured into Pictish territory and never returned. Forces that had simply vanished from the historical record, leaving behind only whispered rumors and unanswered questions. Now the truth was laid bare in this sacred grove. The painted warriors had been defeating Viking expeditions for years, perhaps decades, without anyone in the Norse world even realizing it. The discovery shattered the last vestiges of confidence among Magnus Bloodaxe's men. They were not the first to attempt this conquest. They were merely the latest in a long line of failures, and their weapons would soon join the collection beneath the ancient oaks unless they found a way to escape this nightmarish landscape. That evening, as the demoralized raiders huddled around their fires, they began to understand the true genius of their enemy's strategy. The painted warriors weren't trying to destroy them through superior force or tactical brilliance. They were demonstrating something far more profound and disturbing. They were proving that Viking methods, Viking assumptions, and Viking confidence were not universal truths, but merely one approach to warfare among many. The Picts had studied their enemies with the patience of scholars and the dedication of craftsmen. They understood that Vikings relied on momentum, fear, and the psychological impact of their reputation. Strip away those advantages, force them to fight on unfamiliar terms, and even the most legendary warriors became vulnerable mortals stumbling through an alien world. But the painted warriors' greatest weapon wasn't their tactical sophistication or their mastery of guerrilla warfare. It was their absolute confidence in their own methods. They fought without doubt, without hesitation, without the need to prove anything to anyone. This wasn't about glory or individual heroism. This was about protecting their homeland, using every advantage their ancestors had spent centuries developing. The contrast with Viking mentality couldn't have been more stark. Norse warriors fought for personal reputation, for the approval of their peers, for their place in the halls of the gods. The painted warriors fought for something deeper and more enduring. They fought as part of a living tradition that connected them to the stones beneath their feet and the mists that shrouded their hills. On the fourth night, Magnus Bloodaxe made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. As his remaining men slept fitfully around the dying embers of their fire, he stood and walked to the edge of their defensive perimeter. There, barely visible in the moonlight, he could make out the silhouettes of painted warriors watching from the tree line. For long minutes, predator and prey studied each other across the darkness. Then, slowly and deliberately, Magnus Bloodaxe removed his helmet and placed it on the ground. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. He had finally understood what he was facing, and the knowledge filled him with a mixture of fear and grudging admiration. The painted warriors didn't respond with mockery or triumphant cries. They simply watched as the Viking chieftain picked up his helmet and returned to his men. The message had been received and understood. This was not a conquest that could be achieved through traditional means. When dawn broke, the surviving Vikings began their retreat to the ships. They moved with the careful precision of men who knew they were being observed and evaluated with every step. The painted warriors allowed them to leave unmolested, but their presence was felt like a weight pressing down on the raiders' shoulders. As the longships pushed away from the shore, Magnus Bloodaxe took one final look at the misty Highlands that had humbled his pride and shattered his certainty. He would never speak of what had happened here, not to his crew, not to his family, not to the skalds who would eventually compose his death song. Some defeats were too profound to be shared, too personal to become part of the grand narrative of Viking conquest. But the memory would remain, burning in his mind like a brand. The knowledge that somewhere in the world, there existed people who were not impressed by Viking reputation, not intimidated by Viking fury, and not susceptible to Viking methods. People who had looked at the greatest raiders in history and found them wanting. The painted warriors had achieved something no other enemy had managed. They had forced the Vikings to question not just their tactics or their leadership, but their fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. They had proven that there were other ways to fight, other ways to win, and other definitions of strength that had nothing to do with the ability to inspire terror in one's enemies. This revelation would spread through the Viking world like a contagion, carried by survivors who could not entirely suppress the truth of what they had experienced. Gradually, carefully, the Norse began to adapt their strategies when venturing into certain territories. They learned to recognize the signs of truly dangerous enemies, the ones who fought not for glory or plunder, but for something deeper and more enduring. The painted warriors of the Scottish Highlands had taught the Vikings their most valuable lesson. True strength wasn't about being fearless, it was about knowing when to be afraid and having the wisdom to retreat from battles that could not be won through conventional means. But this was only the beginning of the Vikings' education in fear. Far to the north, in the endless forest where winter reigned supreme, another enemy was waiting. An enemy that would teach them that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't human at all, but the very landscape itself transformed into a weapon by those who understood its secrets. The forests of Finland stretched endlessly in every direction, a frozen cathedral of pine and birch that seemed to swallow sound itself. Here, in the winter of 867, another group of Viking raiders was about to discover that their reputation meant nothing to an enemy that had been shaped by ice and silence for thousands of years. Eric the Red-Handed had chosen his targets carefully. Intelligence gathered from traders spoke of scattered settlements rich with furs and amber, defended by nothing more than hunters and trappers. The perfect opportunity for a swift winter raid, while other chieftains waited for spring. His fleet of 15 longships had navigated the treacherous Baltic waters with the confidence of men who had never met an obstacle they couldn't overcome. They were about to encounter the Sami. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came when they tried to establish a beachhead. The shoreline appeared deserted, but as they dragged their ships onto the frozen beach, their scouts reported strange markings in the snow. Not footprints exactly, but grooves and patterns that suggested movement without weight, travel without impact. It was as if ghosts had been dancing across the landscape. Eric dismissed these concerns with the arrogance of a man who had sacked monasteries across 3 kingdoms. Superstitious nonsense from warriors who had spent too many nights listening to the wind howl through the rigging. But as they began their march inland, following what appeared to be a well-travelled path, the forest itself seemed to shift around them. Trees that had been clearly visible moments before were suddenly obscured by drifting snowpaths that had seemed obvious, branched and divided, until no one could remember which direction they had come from. The sun, when it was visible at all through the canopy, seemed to move in impossible directions. Within hours, the most experienced navigators in Eric's crew were admitting they had no idea where they were, but they were being watched, always watched. The Sami hunters moved through their domain with a fluidity that defied comprehension. They glided across the snow on devices the Vikings had never seen before, long strips of wood and bone that distributed their weight so efficiently they left barely a trace of their passage. While the Norse raiders sank knee-deep into drifts with every step, their pursuers floated across the surface like spirits made manifest. These weren't the painted warriors of Scotland, whose psychological warfare had been designed to intimidate and demoralize. The Sami employed something far more subtle and infinitely more deadly. They didn't want to frighten their enemies. They wanted to study them, to understand their weaknesses, and then to exploit those vulnerabilities with surgical precision. The hunting began on the second night. Vikings prided themselves on their ability to establish secure camps even in hostile territory. They had perfected the art of defensive positioning through centuries of raids and battles, but their methods had been developed for enemies who fought like they did, with direct confrontation and obvious intent. The Sami fought like the winter itself, patient and inexorable. The first sign of attack wasn't violence but absence. Sentries posted at regular intervals around the camp simply ceased to exist. No cries of alarm, no sounds of struggle, no evidence of combat. When their watch periods ended, they were replaced by empty spaces in the snow and weapons that lay exactly where they had been dropped. Eric's remaining warriors found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to understand the very essence of fear. Not the quick terror of sudden violence, but the slow, grinding horror of inevitability. Every hour brought fresh evidence that they were completely outmatched by opponents they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't fight using any tactics in their considerable repertoire. The psychological impact was devastating. These were men who had faced Saxon berserkers and Irish champions in single combat. They had charged shield walls that should have been impenetrable and emerged victorious through sheer audacity and skill. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for an enemy that refused to engage on their terms. By the third day, the Vikings realized they weren't fighting human opponents at all. They were fighting the forest itself, animated by an intelligence that had spent millennia learning to kill intruders with perfect efficiency. Every tree seemed positioned to conceal an archer. Every drift of snow might hide a trap. Every breath of wind might carry the whisper of an approach they would never hear coming. The Sami had weaponized the very concept of winter. While the Vikings struggled with heavy furs that restricted their movement and slowed their reactions, their enemies wore clothing so perfectly adapted to the climate that they seemed immune to cold entirely. They could lie motionless in snowbanks for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They could travel vast distances while their prey remained trapped in an ever-shrinking circle of visibility. But their most terrifying weapon was their absolute mastery of the psychological landscape. They understood that fear wasn't just an emotion, but a tactical tool that could be refined and directed with mathematical precision. They knew exactly how long to wait between attacks to maximize uncertainty. They knew which members of the Viking force to target to create the greatest disruption of morale and command structure. The revelation that shattered Eric's remaining confidence came when his men discovered one of their missing comrades. They found him seated peacefully against a tree, his weapons laid neatly beside him, his face bearing an expression of strange serenity. He had been dead for hours, but there were no wounds, no signs of violence, no indication of how his life had ended. It was as if the cold itself had simply reached out and claimed him, stealing his breath and his warmth with such gentleness that he had died without ever realizing he was under attack. This was warfare refined to an art form that transcended mere violence. This was death as a craft practiced by masters who had spent generations perfecting their technique. The surviving Vikings began to understand that they weren't facing human enemies who happened to be skilled at winter warfare. They were confronting something far more fundamental and terrifying. They were fighting people who had become extensions of the landscape itself, who thought like the ice and planned like the wind. Eric the Red-Handed had earned his name through decades of brutal combat. But as he watched his force diminish with each passing hour, he felt something he had never experienced before. Not fear of death, which was the natural companion of every warrior, but fear of irrelevance. Fear that everything he had accomplished, everything he represented, was nothing more than a crude approximation of warfare when compared to the elegant lethality surrounding him. The Sami didn't need to prove their superiority through dramatic gestures or intimidating displays. They demonstrated it through results, through the methodical elimination of threats with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. They fought without anger, without hatred, without any of the emotions that Vikings believed were essential to victory in battle. On the fourth night, as Eric sat beside a dying fire surrounded by the remnants of his once proud force, he finally understood what he was facing. These weren't warriors in any sense he recognized. They were something far more dangerous. They were the living embodiment of a hostile environment that had learned to think, to plan, and to kill with purpose. The attack that finally broke his resolve came not as a dramatic assault, but as a simple demonstration of helplessness. As dawn broke on what would be their final day in the forest, the Vikings discovered that their retreat route had vanished, not blocked or defended, but simply erased as completely as if it had never existed. The path they had followed into the forest was gone, replaced by terrain that none of them recognized. Trees they were certain they had passed the day before were nowhere to be seen. Landmarks they had carefully noted had been replaced by identical groves that offered no guidance for navigation. They were lost, not just in space, but in a reality that seemed to shift and change according to rules they couldn't comprehend. The Sami had achieved something that no Viking enemy had ever managed. They had made the raiders disappear from their own story. There would be no glorious death songs, no tales of heroic last stands, no legends to inspire future generations. There would simply be silence, as complete and final as the snow that covered their tracks. When spring finally came to the Baltic forests, Other Viking crews would find the abandoned longships and wonder what had happened to Eric the Red-Handed and his men. Some would speculate about storms or navigation errors. Others would whisper about supernatural forces and cursed lands. But none would guess the truth. The truth was that they had encountered an enemy that fought not for glory or plunder, but for something far more primal and enduring. The Sami defended their homeland not through superior weapons or tactical brilliance, but through absolute unity with the environment that had shaped them. They had become winter itself, patient and implacable, and ultimately victorious. The few Vikings who eventually escaped these frozen territories carried with them a lesson that would reshape Norse understanding of warfare itself. They learned that true mastery wasn't about imposing your will through force, but about becoming so perfectly adapted to your environment that you ceased to be an intruder and became instead an integral part of the landscape's defensive systems. But perhaps the most disturbing lesson was this. There were places in the world where Viking methods, Viking assumptions, and Viking confidence were not just inadequate, but actively counterproductive. Places where the very qualities that had made them legendary elsewhere became fatal weaknesses that marked them for destruction. The painted warriors of Scotland had taught them to fear superior tactics and psychological warfare. The forest peoples of the north had taught them to fear the landscape itself when wielded by those who understood its secrets. But there was one more lesson waiting, one that would prove the most devastating of all. Sometimes the greatest enemy you can face is yourself, perfected and stripped of all weakness. Sometimes the most terrifying opponent is someone who knows exactly how you fight, because they learned from the same traditions, but who has taken those methods and refined them beyond recognition. In the fortified island of Yomsborg, a brotherhood of warriors was waiting warriors, who called themselves Vikings, but who had rejected everything that made the Norse vulnerable. They had studied their own people's weaknesses with the same methodical attention that the Sami studied winter, and they had created something unprecedented in the history of warfare. They had created Vikings who could defeat Vikings, and when the traditional raiders finally encountered these perfected versions of themselves, they would discover that the most dangerous enemy of all was not foreign tactics or alien environments, but their own potential realized by those who possessed the discipline to achieve it. The fortress of Yomsborg rose from the Baltic waters like a monument to everything the Viking world thought it understood about warfare. But this was no ordinary stronghold built by kings or jarls seeking to protect their territories. This was something far more unsettling. This was where Vikings had gone to learn how to kill other Vikings. The Yomsvikings weren't born from any single clan or bloodline. They were forged from a radical idea that would have been considered heretical in most Norse halls. The idea that tradition, honor, and individual glory were weaknesses that could be exploited by enemies who understood them better than those who practiced them. Their founder, a warrior whose true name has been lost to history, but who was known simply as the lawgiver, had witnessed the defeats in Scotland and Finland. He had seen how Viking predictability had become a weapon in the hands of their enemies. More importantly, he had understood the fundamental flaw that made these defeats inevitable. Vikings fought as individuals seeking personal glory within the loose framework of a raiding party. Even their most disciplined formations dissolved into personal duels once battle was joined. They celebrated reckless courage over careful planning. They valued the dramatic gesture over the effective strike. They were, in short, everything that their enemies had learned to counter. The lawgiver's solution was as brilliant as it was disturbing. If Viking methods were predictable, he would create Vikings who were unpredictable. If Viking individualism was a weakness, he would forge warriors who thought as one mind. If Viking tradition had become a liability, he would build a new tradition based on pure effectiveness. The recruitment process alone would have horrified traditional Norse society. Bloodline meant nothing at Yomsborg. Family connections were irrelevant. Past glories were forgotten. The only qualification for membership was the ability to survive a testing process so brutal that most candidates died before completing it. Those who did survive emerged transformed. They had been stripped of everything that made them individuals and rebuilt as components of a perfect killing machine. They shared no personal ambitions because personal ambition led to poor tactical decisions. They formed no emotional attachments because love and friendship created hesitation in critical moments. They followed no gods because divine favor was unreliable and prayers were a waste of time that could be spent training. What they created was unprecedented in the Viking world, a force that combined Norse ferocity with the disciplined precision of a Roman legion and the tactical flexibility of the painted warriors who had humbled Magnus Bloodaxe. They were Vikings who had learned to think like their enemies while retaining the physical advantages that had made their people legendary. Their training methods were kept secret, but survivors of encounters with Yomsvikings reported fighting techniques that seemed impossible. Warriors who moved in perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's actions with supernatural accuracy. Combat formations that adapted instantly to changing battlefield conditions, without any visible communication between participants. Individual fighters who seemed to possess the collective knowledge and experience of the entire brotherhood. The first traditional Viking force to encounter the Jomsvikings in battle was led by Thorvald's Skull Splitter, a chieftain whose reputation had been built on 3 decades of successful raids across the known world. He commanded 200 warriors, men who had proven themselves in battles from the Irish Sea to the rivers of Russia. They approached Yomsborg confident that whatever strange customs these island dwellers had adopted, they were still fundamentally Norse and therefore predictable. They were catastrophically wrong. The battle began at dawn, and by midday, it was over. Not because the Jomsvikings possessed superior numbers or better equipment, but because they fought with a coordination that seemed to transcend human limitation. While Thorvald's men charged forward in the traditional manner, seeking individual combat and personal glory, their enemies moved like a single organism with dozens of limbs. Every Viking attack was anticipated and countered before it could develop. Every tactical adjustment was met with a response that seemed to have been prepared in advance. Most disturbing of all, the Jomsvikings showed no interest in the kind of heroic single combat that was the cornerstone of Norse warfare. They killed efficiently and moved on, treating their enemies like obstacles to be removed, rather than worthy opponents to be honored. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These traditional raiders found themselves fighting mirror images of themselves, but mirrors that reflected back everything they could have become if they had been willing to sacrifice their humanity for perfect effectiveness. It was like fighting ghosts of their own potential, and the experience left survivors questioning everything they thought they knew about what it meant to be a warrior. Thorvald himself survived only because the Jomsvikings had no interest in taking prisoners or creating martyrs. When the battle ended, he was allowed to gather his remaining men and retreat with the understanding that he would carry word of what he had witnessed back to the traditional Viking world. The message was clear and terrifying. Everything you think makes you strong actually makes you weak. And we are what you could become if you were willing to pay the price. The legends speak of Vikings who feared nothing and no one, but the truth carved in blood across forgotten battlefields tells a different story. The Picts proved that superior tactics and psychological warfare could humble even the most legendary raiders. The Sami demonstrated that mastery of environment could transform winter itself into an unstoppable weapon. The Jomsvikings revealed that sometimes the greatest enemy is your own potential perfected by those with the discipline to achieve it. These weren't defeats born of cowardice or weakness, but of intelligence. The Vikings learned to fear the right enemies, and in doing so, they evolved from mindless raiders into something far more dangerous. They discovered that true strength isn't about being fearless. It's about knowing when to retreat, when to adapt, and when to learn from those who have found better ways to wage war. The painted warriors, the ice hunters, and the brotherhood of perfected Vikings each taught the Norse the same fundamental lesson. Victory belongs not to the strongest or the bravest, but to those who understand that warfare is not about honor or glory, but about survival and effectiveness. In the end, the Vikings' greatest conquest wasn't any kingdom or territory. It was the conquest of their own assumptions, their own limitations, and their own fear of acknowledging that somewhere in the world there were enemies who had already surpassed them.